Um, Thank you for that excellent panel. If you all want to connect with the speakers, I'm sure they are hanging out. They will be hanging out for some time. So please feel free to go and ask your questions. We are challenging ourselves to a completely virtual panel, and the only person who is going to be in person is me out here moderating it. Uh, and it's wonderful to see that we have all our panelists online. Let me quickly introduce all of them. Uh, Akar Patel is joining us from Bangalore. He's the Amnesty India chair, a journalist and author. We have John Quinley joining us from Bangkok. He's the director of Fortify Rights. We have Sunita Vishwanath joining us from New York, and she is the co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights, and she's also a women and human rights activist. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. The discussion today is about misinformation, marginalization, and discrimination of people on the move. Sunita, I know in the interest of time, and I know you have to jump off and leave early. Um, so I'm going to come to you first. Uh, Living in India, we have seen a lot of misinformation in what we call the WhatsApp school uh, or the school of WhatsApp. A lot of information just goes out viral. Uh, the kind of terminology that is used in these WhatsApp messages, they're made to look very authentic. Headlines in newspapers are edited and photoshopped to make it look like amazing things are happening when the reality is not so amazing. I want to understand you do a lot of work with the Indian diaspora there. And you also kind of raise awareness about issues in India. I want to hear from you about what kind of misinformation do you have to tackle or deal with or try to dispel when you work in the US?
Thank you so much, Priyadi, and it's wonderful to be on this panel with Akar and John. Really fantastic job to Azadi Project in organizing this event. We are Hindus for Human Rights. We're 4 years old. And on the one hand, we add a Hindu voice to social justice movements and struggles in the diaspora, in the US particularly, where most of us are. But we also address human rights and social justice in South Asia, particularly India. And we go into the Hindu community to address social justice issues and bring them up in the Hindu community. That is a big part of what we do. The reason we do that is that what we see as the dark direction that India, the country that most of us are from in Hindus for Human Rights, is going in, it is number one imperative that those of us who are Hindus of conscience speak up and do something. But also, there is to your point, there's so much misinformation coming out of the Hindu right, and it lands right in the Hindu community. And the Hindu community sort of swallows it, just drinks it in, hook, line, and sinker. So when we go into, it's Diwali time right now. When we go into Diwali gatherings, for instance, I went to one. If I talk about what's happening in Manipur, I find that a lot of people don't really even know. They don't even know. And it's astounding to me because these issues are, what's happening in Manipur has been on the front pages of international press. It's amazing to me that people don't know. So it's not just about misinformation. It's also about this thing of which news feed is reaching who. So we are trying to get into news feeds, WhatsApp channels of our families and our community members with, if not, if not with the news, with questions. If we raise Manipur, maybe some people in those channels will go and find out what is she talking about and access some news. So it's misinformation, and it's just lack of news reaching certain parts of our community. And in terms of misinformation, I don't need to tell you all the dire consequences of the misinformation. We learned that right now, we know that Israel is carpet bombing Gaza. And we learned, there's been several reports out that a lot of the misinformation around that issue is actually coming out of India. It's chilling. And then to the point that the President of the United States repeats some of the heinous lies coming out of India. So the importance of tackling it head on, I can't overstate.
Yeah, so I think to your point, there's an entire factory which kind of produces this kind of misinformation and pretty much works very rigorously to do this. But it's not only, I know we're doing this, we're hosting this in India, and a lot of this focuses on India and South Asia, but it is not just the Indian, uh, the system in India, right? It is in other countries as well. And I know, John, you do a lot of work on the Rohingya refugees, and you've done this for years and decades. And you travel to countries like Bangladesh, where you try and see the plight of Rohingya refugees, raise awareness around them, write reports around them. There is a lot of misinformation, yes, about them in India, but there is a lot of misinformation about the Rohingya refugees, even in Bangladesh or Malaysia or Thailand. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, thanks for having me today. Apologies, a bit loud where I am. Uh, I just going off what Sunita was talking about on the use of WhatsApp to spread misinformation. We're seeing this in Malaysia as well. During the start of COVID, there was a big refugee, anti-Rohingya sentiment spread primarily through WhatsApp, through Facebook. What we're seeing in Bangladesh is the use of WhatsApp to threaten Rohingya people. Bangladesh originally, Sheikh Hasina, the president of Bangladesh, originally took in Rohingya refugees, hosted them for many years. But 7 years on from the genocidal violence that took place in Myanmar and why the Rohingya fled to Bangladesh was because of that ongoing persecution. 7 years on, the sentiment of Bangladeshi people in southern Bangladesh, particularly, this is Cox's Bazar district, this is Teknaf, is very anti-refugee. 2 months ago, the mayor of Cox's Bazar district held a protest against Rohingya refugees and tried to garner support against the refugee population. This is also this is people in power that are in Bangladesh, also basically making refugee people's lives really difficult. So I know part of this panel today is around misinformation, but also we've documented widespread discrimination against refugee populations, Rohingya populations. The government of Bangladesh is discriminatory against Rohingya people every day. There's discriminatory travel restrictions against refugees. They're not allowed to leave the camps. There's been fencing built around, barbed wire fencing built around the refugee camps. This is about 1 million people that are fenced in. These restrictions, are not geared towards the host community. They're completely discriminatory. Um, Refugees are not allowed to access formal education. This is also discriminatory because the host community it is. And if you look at some of Bangladesh's international obligations and also their domestic obligations, they've they've signed up for the ICCPR, and that protects refugees from discrimination, particularly around freedom of movement, access to education, and other basic rights. So we see this misinformation spreading on WhatsApp post-COVID, and we're also seeing discriminatory policies and practices in places like Bangladesh. If folks speak to Rohingya refugees themselves, they'll hear this, and yeah. So I'm just here to try to raise
Yeah, so
some of
I
their
think what
plight.
you're trying to say, I think what you're trying to say is the misinformation and a combination of the discriminatory policies together make it really impossible or very difficult, in this case, for people on the move, for migrants or refugees. I just want to come to the word illegal. You know how the word illegal is used. It's again, we see so much of this circulating: illegal migrants, illegal humans. All of this sounds, even the terminology doesn't sound legal to me. So, Akar, coming to you, we heard so much of this when the NRC CA was happening in Assam. or when we have an overall conversation around this, who are the illegal immigrants, who are the illegal migrants? We should have a national register of citizens. And I know you all have done a report on this. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. There's a context here, which is a political and historical. That the ideology that is governing India today has seen India as a civilizational power, and the geography of this civilizational power begins in Iran. Uh, it encompasses what is today Afghanistan and Pakistan. According to Golwalkar, it also included Tibet. On the east, it also includes lands that go up to Singapore. So the Bharat Mata, as she is visualized, is about twice as large as India is today. The paradox is that we hate the people. We don't want the people. The people are seen as not from the same civilization, even though the outsider might not be able to visually tell us apart, that we all seem to look the same to somebody who's visiting here from, say, Iceland or Mongolia. Uh, the the hatred is also paradoxical in the sense that culturally we are told things like Atithi Devo Bhava, whereas what has happened in Assam, and I was listening into the last bits of the previous session, and I don't want to repeat what may have been said there, but the genesis of what happened in Assam, especially the trigger for the recent NRC, was that the state, including the judiciary, saw migrants not only as a nuisance but as a national security threat. And what followed from that perception, both from the Supreme Court, then the Guwahati High Court, which refused um, the right to appeal, was that 2 million people are in limbo. We don't know where those 2 million people who have been left out of the Assam NRC are, what they are to do, what threat they live under, to be able to go to bed every night not knowing whether you will be jailed tomorrow, whether parts of your family will be jailed, as has been the case, has become normalized. And I think that we should look at ourselves, maybe not in this at this point in time, because I don't think that we are going through a period in our history where we have the sanity to be able to do that. But perhaps in a generation's time, to look at what we've done to our own people and at what scale, and see what forms of internal resistance have actually existed within the framework of a constitution that has a functioning judiciary, that has a supposedly independent media. What are the forms of resistance that came up to stop the state from doing what it did? That the National Human Rights Commission sent a team of people to Assam. This is not part of our report. I'm just reporting it, and they found that people who were not able to prove that they were in the place since before 71, or that their parents or their grandparents were not there in that place before 1971, were just sent to jail. People were sent to jail for having different spellings of their name on the voter ID card as opposed to the Aadhaar card or their PAN card. And then that's it. There was one A here, one E there, and that was it. The people who were doing this, the foreigners tribunals, were 2-year contractors that the government, the BJP government, had picked. And according to an affidavit the government itself filed in Guwahati High Court, only those people who marked maximum number of people, foreigners, were actually given an extension to their contract. So people were actually incentivized to send fellow human beings to jail. These are very large problems, and I don't know whether a session or a panel. I'm glad you're doing this, by the way. Very few fora actually exist for us to talk about this sort of thing. But it's so monumental, the scale of what we are doing to ourselves, that I think that we need to, as a nation, as a people, we need to think about what it is that we've done at the right point in time, perhaps also introspect.
Akar, so you speak of internal resistance, and from what I see and a lot of us see here, all kinds of sources of internal resistance are being thwarted. There is kind of no internal resistance mechanism, or very few here and there that are happening. Coming to you, Sunita, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's comparatively easier to raise these issues when you're outside of the country because you don't have the fear of facing certain consequences. However, having said that, what do you think is the way forward? Is the way forward to raise these issues, to call out the misinformation, to call out the discrimination that is happening back home from outside, or how do we challenge this?
Um, yeah, I mean, what you said when I spoke before, and you said the misinformation is not just coming from India, and the problems are not just in India. It really resonated with me, and we could be talking. We're talking about refugees and people on the move, and we could be talking about the other country other than India, where I have focused a lot of my um, years of my life is Afghanistan, and to think about 1.7 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan who are being viciously deported right now. I mean, and because of the war on Gaza right now, that is not even making it into the front pages. It's just completely unconscionable, and just don't just. I'm often just lost for words at the cruelty all around. But to your point, um, all of us, not just Hindus for Human Rights, but all of our partner organizations out here in America, Indian American Muslim Council, Dalit Solidarity Forum, India Civil Watch International, a number of groups like a Christian organization called Fiakona, a Manipuri organization called Namta. So many of us, we band together, and what we find is that the Indian government has a lot of influence, direct influence on institutions, conferences, universities out here. And for instance, when there was a hate monger, Hindutva hate monger speaking in Parliament of World Religions, a lot of people banded together to get that speaker uninvited. And the Consul General wrote letters to say, let this person speak. I mean, there's a lot of, it's very interesting that a government entity would step into a a non-profit conference like that. So there's a lot of the fingerprint of the government is very much around us here in the diaspora in America, especially, and so we have to face it everywhere we go. It happened, all the Diwali events right now that the mayor of New York, his Diwali event, or the Consul General's Diwali events around the country. For us to step into those spaces is stepping into spaces that are just choking with Islamophobia and a kind of the power and the empowerment of Hindutva ideology. So it's very hard to just exist in the space where we are doing our resistance. But we are very conscious that what we are facing here is nothing compared to what folks inside India are facing. And so as long as we have a platform to speak and do our work and correct some of the lies, we offer ourselves in complete solidarity to all of you fighting this fight inside India. And the stakes, they are not as high, but there are the stakes that we face. A number of us, two of us from Hindus for Human Rights, somebody from Indian American Muslim Council, a couple of other people. So 2 Hindus, a Muslim, a Christian, and an educator, because an educator opens minds, and this ideology needs our minds closed. The 5 of us were sued by the largest Hindu American organization, Hindu American Foundation. We were sued for defamation. It's very symbolic that they sued us together, because us being together is a real threat. But we refused to be divided, and we won that lawsuit. The fight, the attacks continue right now. Indian American Muslim Council and Hindus for Human Rights, our Twitter accounts, our X accounts, are blocked inside India, and we're trying to fight that. And that goes to the point of, it's not just misinformation, it is lack of access to information. If you are in a certain place, you will not get certain news. You will not get Hindus for Human Rights Twitter feed if you are inside India. You just won't see what we said yesterday. And so that's something that we do everything we can to tell anybody we can, that just know that you're not getting accurate information. I do need to go, and
That's
to
fine.
all the people watching,
Thank you, Sunita.
the reason I'm going is that I need to get into the car and pick up some people and make it to the DC March for Gaza. So it's a good reason, so please forgive. But I just want to end with one really important note. So even in the progressive spaces, the liberal, lefty, progressive, spaces that very much pride themselves of standing against the right-wing ideology that's ruling India right now. Even in those spaces, it is very hard for a group like Hindus for Human Rights to have a space to speak. And so I really am grateful that you are letting us speak. But many times we have to sort of elbow our way in because we're a Hindu organization. And so I would say to all of us who care, all of us that are working so hard to change course, for an India to change course, and honestly, for many parts of the world have the same issue. Please, in your hearts and in your work, make room for the possibility of a faith-based resistance to far-right ideology. It's not the only response, but I fully believe that without that sliver of faith-based resistance to atrocities taking place in the name, misuse, no doubt, but in the name of religion, I don't think it can succeed. And I think part of the reason we are here is because faith-based activists and proponents have not been welcome into spaces of resistance. I'll give you one quick example and I'll go. In December 2021, there was a horrible, horrific, heinous gathering of Hindu religious leaders in Haridwar, India. And these hundreds of saffron-clad men and women literally, actually, explicitly called for a genocide against Muslims. And it was in all the papers. It was even in the New York Times, like more than one article in the New York Times. It was famously known across the world. So then in September of this year, a group of 25, which if you know India, it's amazing, 25 Hindu religious leaders, including 6 women, gathered in Haridwar to have what they called a Satya Dharam Samvad, a gathering of truth and dharma, religious, correct, righteous religious dharma duty. This happened in spite of the risks of doing such a thing in a country like India today. So these Hindu religious leaders not only gathered, they gathered in love to speak out against the violence happening all around, and they took what they called a do or die oath for India. They were, organized enough that they had a social media handle, they had a website, and they put out a press release to everywhere that they knew. There was no news of it. And that's really on us. There was one little piece in Times of India. And that's it. And I know for a fact that that press release went to everyone we know, every media house that we might know on the left, and lots of mainstream media news. And it could be, you can understand why the mainstream media news maybe didn't cover this, but why didn't the progressive news make room for 25 brave Hindu religious leaders saying not in our name to the atrocity that's happening in India? And I ask us, as Akar said, to introspect. And if we don't have room for these swamis and sadhvis, then what change are we talking about? I leave you with that question, and I'm sorry.
That's a great point, Sunita. And thank you for joining us today. We'll have to let you go, I know. But just talking and coming to the last question to you, John, and then to you, Ankar, if we can just say quickly respond to this. What Sunita said about it's not just misinformation, it's lack of information. And I know that this lack of information is not just in the context of India, but there's obviously lack of information in the context of other countries. And bringing it back to the refugee and migration issue, refugees don't have a control of their own narrative, right? It is others talking about them. And a lot of others who actually try to give the correct information also face consequences and are attacked or are subjected to threat. John, in your work, have you ever had to deal with threats or questions, what's going to be safe to take out, bring the report out. I know you work with refugees and you're very mindful of how you keep the security of the refugees intact. So could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. Just going back on something Sanita was talking about is the role of diaspora organizations. And I think when refugees are doing their own human rights documentation, we come alongside refugee organizations try to support them to do their own human rights documentation. That's quite risky. So there is a role for diaspora organizations to speak publicly when the risk is a little bit um, less severe in the countries that they're living in. So you have Rohingya diaspora organizations, critiquing what's happening in India, the detention of refugees. You have Rohingya diaspora organizations critiquing the the restrictions in Bangladesh. Refugees in Bangladesh and refugees in India aren't able to do that safely. So I think that's a critical point, is that linkage between the refugee communities in Bangladesh, in India, and the global diaspora. And those two things have to be intertwined, have to be working really closely together. On your question on reprisals, I have colleagues here in Thailand, Thai human rights defender colleagues that have done research on slave labor in chicken farm, uh, Myanmar people being put in chicken farms, being made to work long hours, basically labor rights abuses. These Thai colleagues have been sued with criminal defamation here in Thailand. Defamation is a criminal charge, not a civil offense. And though they're being sued just for speaking out for Myanmar migrant workers here in the country. One of my colleagues has been going through legal battles in the courts here for more than 3 years. This takes a major toll on local human rights defenders, and it takes a major toll on the organizations that those local human rights defenders are working with.
Yeah. John, thanks. And Akar, you faced this personally. We can't hear you, Akar. Can you unmute?
Sorry about that. No, I said it's part of it. We should be fortunate that we live in a space where, unlike China, at least certain freedoms exist and they should be used. That it is true that the freedoms under Article 19, particularly that of, say, assembly, association, and speech, are severely restricted. And I don't remember in my 54 years a time when they were this restricted. But space still does exist there. I think that to many people who are in jail as pre-trial detainees with no charge sheet, no knowledge of when their trial will actually commence, it would be, I think, foolhardy for me to say that we have an independent justice system, but we do, notionally at least, and that space has to be used. And I think that the heroes and the heroines of our time, to a large extent, come from the lawyers. I think that what they're doing and continue to do, fighting what might be for most people a losing battle, putting on that armor, the black coat every day and going off to war, as people like Sipal do, people like Rebecca John do, people like Indira Jaising do. I think it is to be admired, and I think it gives the rest of us courage and confidence that there is space and that space has to be used.
Whoever's dog that is, that's wonderful. Akar and John, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for having this conversation and saying some very critical things which need to be heard. Thank you so much. And we don't have time for questions because we're already running late. We'll move on to the next one.